To turn a massive global energy operation around requires immense physical force and an entirely new commercial direction. Take Shell. In 2024, the company reported a staggering total greenhouse gas footprint of roughly 1.2 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. But looking at this visual block representing that massive total, you will see a tiny slice at the top. Shell's direct operations, the physical assets they actually own and operate, accounts for only about 5% of the problem. The remaining 95%, roughly 1,084 million tons, pulses below it. These are Scope 3 value chain emissions, the indirect carbon output of everyone they do business with. Shell has committed to aggressive net carbon intensity reduction goals of 15 to 20% by 2030. Mathematically, they cannot hit those targets by only cleaning up their internal 5% slice. Because internal reductions fall short of the math, these corporate climate pledges are really just targets for other people's emissions. Those other people fall into two distinct groups: the downstream customers burning the product and the upstream suppliers building the infrastructure. For any B2B vendor selling into an energy major, corporate sustainability is shifting away from a moral checkbox and toward a core commercial requirement. To see how a corporate procurement department analyzes that massive Scope 3 footprint, we have to look for the actionable leverage points. This breakdown shows the largest Scope 3 chunk, 845 million tons from sold products, shearing off. Procurement cannot touch this downstream segment. Instead, we isolate the specific target it controls, the 119 million ton Category 1 inside the procurement control zone. Category 1 is the supply chain. It encompasses every contractor, every equipment vendor, and every logistics provider. Everyone Shell writes a check to. Shell applies standard contractual levers here. They require adherence to the Shell Supplier principles, mandating basic environmental compliance, resource efficiency, and waste minimization. But that basic adherence is merely the contractual floor. Buyers now demand vendors go much further to track performance and exchange specific emissions data. If you are a B2B vendor selling to big oil, your internal operations have been officially mapped as the buyer's controllable climate lever. In the past, companies used a fast, cheap method to estimate the emissions embedded within their supply chains. Looking at this strict filtering process, the old standard hits a wall. Spend-based estimates, multiplying supplier spend by generic industry averages, are rejected as too crude. What passes the filter now is the multifaceted node of primary data. This new mandate of primary data means a supplier must provide their own accurately measured Scope 1, 2, and increasingly Scope 3 figures. Sustainable procurement applications translate this mandate into reality. They have shifted from simple questionnaires to complex environmental data portals, requiring highly specific metrics. The expectations are tiered. Mid-tier suppliers must provide activity data, like material weights and transport distances, to feed the buyer's calculations. Top and strategic suppliers face a much steeper requirement. They are expected to provide full entity-level scope data and commit to shared, ongoing decarbonization roadmaps. Submitting generic secondary data now signals operational immaturity, instantly downgrading a vendor from a strategic partner to a quantifiable commercial risk. Severe external pressure is forcing global energy markets to harden these data requests into absolute, non-negotiable legal requirements. The EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, is driving this shift. It makes Scope 3 reporting mandatory for large companies starting in the 2025 financial year. The European Sustainability Reporting Standard for Climate, ESRS E1, forces buyers to disclose their ratio of primary to secondary Scope 3 data. Notice how primary vendor data pushes the ledger's credibility gauge into the green, while secondary data drags it red. Buyers aren't legally forced to hit 100% primary data, but they need a consistently high proportion of real supplier data to pass audits and produce a credible public disclosure. Because a buyer's public regulatory score depends entirely on what their suppliers hand over, the demand for primary data cascades aggressively down the supply chain. This mechanism legally exposes vendors of every size, Even smaller mid-tier suppliers not directly regulated by the CSRD themselves are caught in the reporting net. Big Oil's regulatory compliance relies strictly on their suppliers' data literacy. Carbon accounting is now a direct proxy for long-term vendor viability. The commercial reality is straightforward. Supplier carbon data has become a definitive qualification gate, separating the vendors who win contracts from the vendors who get cut. The fatal mistake unprepared vendors make is treating the sustainable procurement application as an administrative chore, answering strict data requirements with vague statements of future intent. The first step in the engineered playbook is to measure early. Vendors must calculate credible Scope 1 and 2 numbers and define a Scope 3 starting position long before the buyer's questionnaire ever arrives. Next, you productize the data. This flowchart shows the ultimate commercial asset, the verified product carbon footprint. While vague intent hits a brick wall, hard PCF data flows seamlessly through the procurement gate, plugging straight into the buyer's system as the low-risk choice. The final step is to sell to the disclosure. Vendors must actively frame their primary data against the buyer's specific net carbon intensity targets and CSRD requirements. Handing over the exact primary data needed for an ESRS E1 audit solves the buyer's multi-million-dollar reporting problem. Treating carbon data as a sales asset ensures a supplier remains locked onto the rationalized vendor list when procurement inevitably makes cuts. In the modern energy supply chain, data beats declarations, and providing primary emission figures is the requirement for remaining in the vendor pool.